Renaka, thank you for the warm welcome. I am old school enough to not have a PowerPoint to go along with this, so I hope that my storytelling will be compelling enough for everybody. And actually, this paper is all about stories, so I better be true to my word. It started off actually as two papers. I was working on two separate papers, one on dispensationalism, and the other on what's called the Kanetonē migration story here in Fiji. And I had a light bulb moment when I realized that actually these two stories run parallel to each other in terms of church history and also how entangled they become in modern geopolitics. So I thought, well, I'll put those together and make one presentation. So here we are. My presentation is called "These Are Not Our Stories," and that is a quote from someone who you'll meet along the way. If you want to understand why a military superpower like the United States and a small Pacific island nation like Fiji both recently moved their embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, please don't first consult social media. Start with history. Global geopolitics is often framed as the rational processes of statecraft, but that assumption really doesn't hold here. To understand what's going on, we'll need to travel back to the 19th century, to a peculiar British theological system and a Fijian newspaper competition. And this is why history matters. We need to know how and when certain ideas emerged and took hold. My focus today is on two parallel 19th century constructions: dispensationalism in Victorian England and later America, and the Kanetonē migration narrative here in Fiji. Although they seem to be completely unrelated, I think we'll find that they converge in surprising ways by generating powerful forms of modern ethno-nationalisms. Before I start, we're dealing with some heavily contested areas of contemporary politics: the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the coups in Fiji, and the polarizations around them. And I sincerely don't want to tread on anyone's toes, so please forgive me in advance if I cause any offense. My aim here is simply to examine, as a historian, how these narratives developed, to outline the internal logic of these belief systems, and to trace how they became national narratives that continue to this day to shape geopolitical policy. For context, our starting point is the 19th century, a period of great upheaval. It was the time of the Industrial Revolution, imperial expansion, Marxist ideology, Darwinian evolutionary theory, and its very ugly corollary, race theory. People forget that Darwin wrote two books. The second one is especially stomach-churningly racist, I have to say. All bets were off. All established institutions were being destabilized. And in that industrial era Britain, at exactly the same time as Cross and Cargill, the Methodist missionaries, were bringing Lotu to Lakemba here in Fiji, a Plymouth Brethren Bible teacher named John Nelson Darby concluded that the established church had lost its way and had become totally apostate. He believed that he alone had recovered the correct hermeneutic, a more faithful, literal, and uncorrupted reading of Scripture. His words: "Sound like the beginnings of a cult? Well, keep listening." Darby developed a new interpretive framework that eventually gets called dispensationalism. It was novel, meaning it had absolutely no precedence in the 18th centuries of church history that went before. Before this, Christian theologians from Irenaeus onwards mostly read biblical history as a single continuous narrative, structured by some form of covenant theology and framed by either amillennial or historic premillennial eschatology. Darby took a meat cleaver to all that, and he sliced and diced it into 7 distinct periods, or dispensations. Each period functioned as a test with the same recursive pattern. God commands, humanity fails, judgment follows, the new dispensation begins. The full system is not necessary here, and honestly, it would be a waste of our time. But there are 7 dispensations in all. What I want to focus on instead is the structure at its center, a sharp dualism between heaven and earth. Humanity is divided into 2 groups in Darby's thinking. The Christian church, Darby calls the heavenly people, with a spiritual destiny, while The nation of Israel, or the descendants of the nations of the ancient nation of Israel, are the earthly people with a destiny tied to a certain piece of real estate that we know of in the Middle East. To make sense of this, Darby claims what dispensationalists call a literal reading of biblical prophecy. Literal dry bones, literal return of all the tribes to that piece of real estate. Ezekiel's expanded temple literally built here on earth, even though the dimensions are absolutely impossible with current topography. But this novel system didn't just stay in Britain. Darby took it on a road trip, making multiple visits to the US, 7 in fact, his perfect number. It was slow going at first, but eventually, in 1909, a lawyer turned evangelist named Cyrus Schofield decided to make Darby's system accessible to the public, thus the Schofield Study Bible. For readers, Darby's teachings in the form of Schofield's notes sat on the same page as Scripture itself and started to carry a similar authority. Over time, generations absorbed this framework as if it were part of the text itself, rather than what it actually was, a recent 19th century aberration. All right, at roughly the same time, a parallel construction was taking place here in Fiji. Before the late 19th century, Itoke origin traditions were all localized accounts of the Vanua. The original belief systems were fiercely tied to a very immediate geography. Most clans or yavusa claimed descent from something that they could literally point to from their village. These could be geographical features like a mountain, a distinctly shaped rock jutting out of the reef, a deep inland cave, something topographical. Or they may claim to have emerged from a specific totemic animal that frequented their bay, or a local mythic hero who literally emerged from the earth. The stories were many, but the overwhelming belief was that they were autochtonos, that is a good word, meaning springing from the earth itself. What we know now from the best current archaeological, linguistic, and genetic studies is that the Fiji Islands were first settled around 3,100 to 3,000 years ago by skilled Austronesian navigators identified by their distinctive dentate stamped lapida pottery, and arriving through a rapid migration from the Bismarck Archipelago via Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Fiji also became a key center for the further settlement of Tonga and Samoa, while continued interaction with Western Pasifika peoples contributed to the distinctive culture emerging from the character of the islands. But the colonial powers wanted a different narrative. They wanted a singular narrative that empire could relate to. In 1892, a Fijian language government newspaper called Namata launched a competition to identify and publish that single definitive origin account for the Fijian people, what we might call crowdsourcing today. Participants combined traditional ancestral names with circulating migration ideas, and the winning entry became a 17-week installment, an epic known as the Conotoni migration story. So here's the story. The journey begins in Thebes, in ancient Egypt. From Thebes, they supposedly travel down to Lake Tanganyika, in the heart of the African continent. Then they make their way to the coast, sail across the Indian Ocean, pass through the Solomon Islands, and finally navigate their way to Fiji, aboard a grand canoe named the Conotoni. It's the Fijian equivalent of the Aeneid or the Odyssey. And just like any great epic, there's a tragedy at the climax. Just as the Conotoni is sailing through a treacherous passage in the Fijian reef, a violent storm hits. During the chaos, a sacred stone box falls overboard and sinks into the abyss. In some versions, it's described as a box of tambua, which are highly prized whale's teeth. In others, the box was said to have contained the written accounts of their ancient genealogy, their laws, and their divine blessings, the Vosa Mana of the Vanua. The loss of the text becomes a monumental theological symbol later. Stripped of their written history, they finally make landfall at Vunda. They establish a beachhead settlement, but eventually the leaders have a falling out, or in some versions, they just decide to spread out. So the crew splits. Chief Latuna Somba Somba either remains on the coast or pushes eastward while his priest, Denge, and his followers march inland, eventually settling in the Nakauvandra Mountains. But here is the great plot twist. Historians are all about sources, oral, textual, material. We need all of them here in Pasifika. But the Conotoni story, this epic tale of Thebes and Tanganyika, is 100% absent from any pre-colonial historical record. That is to say, if it did exist before colonial arrival, it's entirely absent from the oral record, in other words, silent in the Vanua archives. But it's not for lack of any resources on the early days of European contact. In 1865, a Methodist missionary named Jesse Carey spent huge amounts of time and energy collecting 250 different scripts, detailing over 300 ancient gods, myths, and legends, including origin stories from all across Fiji. It was a huge anthropological undertaking and an important missiological story in and of itself. It's a story for another time. The point here is that the Conotoni story is simply not there. There's not even a single mention. No Vunda landing, no Chief Lutuna Somba Somba, no voyage from Africa. But if the Fijian people themselves were not telling this story in the late 1800s, until the late 1800s, how does it suddenly become their defining national myth by the turn of the century? To solve that mystery, we actually have to look at the de jure anthropological concept called diffusionism. Diffusionism was the prevailing and frankly deeply racist anthropological theory of the Victorian era that human innovation is exceptionally rare. Therefore, complex culture, agriculture, societal hierarchy, the kind that they were seeing in Fiji, couldn't have developed independently in different parts of the world. Diffusionists believed that all major human civilizations must trace back to a single high culture source point. And by the late 1800s, that source point was almost always somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, aligning suspiciously and neatly with the Bible, especially Egypt. European explorers, anthropologists, even this new breed of missionaries were absolutely obsessed with finding connections back to the ancient Near East. They were constantly looking for the lost tribes' accounts of Israel or evidence of some Egyptian maritime exploration. Well, the plot thickens. As it turns out, another missionary anthropologist, Laura Murfison, was heavily influenced by a scholar named Lewis Henry Morgan, who championed theories of social evolutionism, which came, of course, straight out of Darwin. Darwin's second book, by the way. They were desperate to fit Fijians into this global Egyptian-centric model. But you can't just say something like that. So how do you link a Pacific Island nation to ancient Thebes? Well, you do so by performing incredible feats of linguistic gymnastics. His buddy Jesse Carey actually wrote a book arguing for this African origin based almost entirely on superficial wordplay. He noticed that a few Fijian villages had names that sounded vaguely similar to towns located around Lake Tanganyika in Africa. Based on that alone, he concluded that the Fijians had escaped from ancient Egypt, migrated down to Tanganyika, and then somehow roamed the oceans until they crashed into the South Pacific. To me, that's a bit like finding a town called Paris in Texas and concluding Texans must have built the Eiffel Tower. Well, when I was in Rewasau, up in the Neitasiri Highlands a little while back, I specifically asked the Matangali, the traditional land custodian, a question about the Conotoni migration story. I had just been reading about it in Elatia Tueri's classic text on the Vanua towards a Fijian theology of place. The Matangali replied, short and sweet, everything that needed to be said. Those are not our stories. He went on to tell me, we didn't come from anywhere. We've always been here. Those are not our stories. So how did these 19th century narratives develop into 21st century ethno-nationalisms? The evidence points to a key mechanism, a redefinition of the idea of a chosen people. So let's pick up on the American trajectory. Dispensationalism took off through preachers like, you might have heard this name, D.L. Moody. He was kind of like the Billy Graham of the century before. And also in institutions like Dallas Theological Seminary, which was basically founded for the purpose of teaching dispensationalism some way, shape, or form. And then Dallas Theological Seminaries, books by their graduates, including one you might have heard of, Hal Lindsey's bestseller from the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth, which reportedly sold over 10 million copies. It also spread through a fever dream of a film called Thief in the Night, which instilled fever dream fear in my parents' generation about missing the rapture and about barcodes and microchips in hands and foreheads. In my generation, in the 80s and 90s, it went viral through the mega million sales of the Left Behind books and their film spin-offs. For several generations, dispensationalism had become the default eschatology for many American evangelicals. Yes, the very ones who had enough global media clout to zealously broadcast all over the world, from Dallas all the way to Rewasau, up in the highlands of Neitasiri. But over the course of the 20th century, it also developed into very increasingly virulent forms of what we now call Christian Zionism. Because Darby's framework insists that God maintains a separate, ongoing, and earthly plan for a political nation of Israel, the establishment of the modern nation state of Israel in 1948 was immediately read as the start of a prophetic countdown. To dispensationalists, the nation state of Israel must exist of necessity as part of the countdown to what they call the rapture, which is, by the way, another 19th century invention. At the center of this political theology was an ironically non-literal reading of Genesis 12:3. Remember, they pride themselves on being literalists. But Genesis 12:3 says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. In context, this addresses Abraham directly. But within Christian Zionist interpretation, the you mysteriously gets applied directly to the modern secular nation state of Israel. But see how this produces another stark binary. American prosperity, freedom, and protection from divine judgment are now explicitly dependent on the binary logic of unwavering support for Israel. Blessing or cursing. Any criticism of Israeli policy, including its illegal settlements, moved goalposts of borders, withholding of water resources, or violating human rights in the name of anti-terrorism, is all treated as inviting divine punishment or curse. It's an absolute zero-sum game. And this removes any sane foreign policy from secular analysis. It's no longer about regional stability or strategic interest. It becomes about avoiding divine judgment. Criticism of the modern nation state of Israel is in any way is met now with charges of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, this exposes an ugly internal tension within dispensationalism itself. Even as its system requires absolute support for the Jewish state, it also instrumentalizes the Jewish people. You see, in dispensationalist eschatology, the Jewish people and the modern state of Israel function pretty much like pawns within a prophetic chess game, a sequential and sacrificial chess move rather than ends in and of themselves. According to Darby's reading of apocalyptic prophecy, the worst is still to come. In fact, the worst is always still to come with Darby. This includes, during the Great Tribulation, the anticipated destruction of 2/3 of the Jewish population, with the surviving remnant eventually converting to Christianity. So political and financial support for Israel is tied to an eschatological framework in which Judaism no longer continues to even exist in its present form. As an aside, if you really want to test just how literal a dispensationalist reading of the scriptures is, just ask them this simple question. Where do the scriptures teach a 7-year tribulation? Chapter and verse, please. Then ask them how it's a literal reading to introduce a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel's 77s in the prophecy in Daniel 9. Explain this, please. Anyway, if you want to stump them, start with those two questions. But herein lies the contradiction. Christian Zionist support for Israel is framed as unconditional in the present, even while its dirty little secret is that the expected future of that same Jewish nation foresees its large-scale suffering. And herein lies so many contradictions, as a people claiming to worship the teacher who said, "My kingdom is not of this world, turn the other cheek and love your enemies," how that becomes Christian Zionism, rooted in dispensational fever, to hurry up the apocalypse, further sacralizing violence by justifying military force and superpower intervention as necessary for prophetic fulfillment. Figures such as the red-faced John Hagee provided theological support for military power in the Middle East advocating unconditional political and military support for the modern state of Israel. And here it is, grounded in the interpretation of Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. At the same time, what I'm calling pop dispensationalism has, well, the pop dispensationalism is, the Left Behind series. Someone really needs to write a book called Why I Left Behind Behind, because that's a title that needs to be written somehow. Anyway, maybe that's for you to do. But this pop dispensationalism has adopted an increasingly masculine vocabulary of warfare, power, military strength, and that's contributed to forms of Christian, like virulent, almost hyper-masculine Christian identity forms, particularly as dispensationalism becomes intertwined with what's now called the new Christian right. This cultural realignment has encouraged a military response that prioritizes defending national sovereignty, traditional values, and a perceived Christian way of life, sometimes expressed through a very pragmatic mentality. When I was in Israel, floating in the Dead Sea, and you can actually float in the Dead Sea, just at the gate of the park where the Dead Sea entry is, vendors were selling T-shirts that said "Guns and Moses," and there were pictures of U.S. Apache gunships saying, "Courage, Israel! America is behind you in the form of these Apache gunships, of course." Underlying these developments is a supremely pessimistic worldview that often regards diplomacy and peacemaking with suspicion, seeing them as even possible precursors to the Antichrist's rule, and thereby encouraging a spiritual and political posture of preparation for conflict rather than reconciliation. All right, now let's go back to Fiji. Once published and incorporated into the colonial education system, the Kaunitoni narrative spread rapidly. Tuere notes that although it was new to Fiji, the author at some point claimed that it came possibly from Benga Island. I have no way to assess that claim, so I'll just have to bookmark that for now. Again, no offense is intended. I'm just following the historical leads here. Within a few decades, it was widely accepted as historical fact across Fiji. A constructed narrative shaped by colonial assumptions and reinforced through print, textbooks, schooling, displaced earlier localized origin accounts. Then in the 1960s, radio broadcasts popularized it even further, and just like that, it became canonical. But the Kaunitoni narrative didn't just remain an interesting migration story. Tragically, this sort of rhetoric got weaponized in political contexts and within my living memory. In 1987, it was used during the military coups in Fiji. Actions justified not only in political terms, but in distinctly religious language. This time with the rhetoric of lost tribes and chosen peoplehood, supported claims of indigenous Itaukei political dominance over an Indian Fijian population. Political struggle got reframed as defense of divinely given land, and the Kaunitoni migration story was at the center. What might be seen as an ethnic or political conflict was now all wrapped up in a flag, with a cross on it, by the way, fulfilling a biblical mandate. And political leaders were being newly cast as Moses and military ones as Joshua. I'm told by students who lived through that time that the pulpit was frequently used to press the book of Jeremiah and Exodus into analogies to justify military takeover. The political struggle for indigenous supremacy had become a literal divine mandate. The Itaukei people, directly linked to the Israelites, framing the Indo-Fijians as the Canaanites, or the Egyptians, obstacles to God's chosen peoplehood, reclaiming their promised land. When you frame a political election as a battle for God's promised land, the political opposition is no longer just a rival party you disagree with. They become enemies of God's will. It makes compromise impossible, again, that zero-sum game. And this internal, highly localized theological narrative has spilled over into the global stage in a way that continues to baffle people like me. So, we return to our starting place, the moving of embassies in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Interestingly, the US and Fiji weren't the only ones to do so, and Fiji wasn't even the only Pacific Island nation to do so. In September 2023, Prime Minister James Marape of Papua New Guinea stated that recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital was a moral obligation inextricably linked to the nation's Christian identity. With over 95% of Papua New Guinea's population identifying as Christian, Marape argued that spiritual fulfillment for a Christian nation should not be separated from acknowledging Jerusalem as the historical and moral capital of the Jewish state. Fiji echoed these sentiments in September 2025, highlighting the shared religious values and cultural connections to the Holy Land, the birthplace of Christianity. But before that, to illustrate just how deep this goes, in February of 2024, a group of pro-Israel activists from the Pacific region traveled to Jerusalem and officially established an indigenous embassy. Let that phrase sink in, an indigenous embassy. The phrasing is incredibly deliberate. It's a masterclass, I think, in narrative alignment. By establishing an indigenous embassy, they're framing their support for the state of Israel as an act of global indigenous solidarity. For many Fijian nationalist perspectives, they align their own claims to land and authority with those of the Jewish state. And America, with its own ethno-nationalist claims to being a Christian nation that blesses Israel to be blessed. In Fiji's case, both are understood as indigenous groups defending land against perceived others, Indo-Fijians in Fiji and Palestinians in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. Once political claims get sacralized, compromise becomes impossible. They're no longer negotiable positions, but divine mandate. It was dispensationalist Christian lobby groups who applied sustained pressure to move the United States Embassy to Jerusalem last decade. Some have raised substantial funds, often using tax-exempt religious networks to support settlement activity in the West Bank. Even bizarrely, they raise funds for the rebuilding of a third temple in Jerusalem, the temple that Jesus prophesied would be destroyed back in 70 AD. And they even go so far as trying to breed a pure red heifer, all in effort to speed up the apocalypse. But that red heifer is just a red herring. The real aim is to align present political realities with a particular reading of biblical prophecy, including what is seen as the full territorial extent of Israel. In this sort of logic, internal law, diplomatic process, including proposals such as the two-state solution, become absolutely impossible. And now, along with the Matangali in Rewasau, I want to say these are not our stories. But it's not just that these are not my stories. The dispensationalist system for the 1800 years before it emerged is nowhere to be found. It's what we call a recent accretion. That means we can actually say no to it. If critics of the Conatoni story are correct, then both of these stories are recent, less than 2 centuries old. But you see why history matters and why historic theology matters. More than that, the problem is how these stories have been co-opted by the ethno-nationalisms. It is a profound testament to the power of storytelling. And it leaves us with a concept that I think everyone should mull over long after we finish here. History is almost never simply a record of what happened in the past. It's more often than not a tool constructed for the desperate needs of the present. If a story submitted to a newspaper in 1892 can completely overwrite the genetic and spiritual memory of a diverse nation or islands that weren't yet called a nation and dictate its international diplomacy over a century later, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. What stories, what other stories are we accepting as ancient, unquestionable truth in our own cultures, our own families, or our own nations today that might simply have been invented yesterday to serve someone else's agenda? These are not our stories. We have much better, much more ancient ones that lead to the thriving of all peoples, Fijian and Indo-Fijian, Israeli and Palestinian. Okay, do I have time for bonus round? Okay, thumbs up from Cole, thank you. I'm going to add one final layer to my analysis here. These theological frameworks do not only shape geopolitical alignments in the Middle East or domestic politics in the Pacific, they also shape how we relate to our physical environment. Turning now to the climate crisis that, as we speak, is causing the relocation of communities in low-lying atolls of Pasifika Island nations. What the Pacific Conference of Churches has been discussing for decades now, from Island of Hope to Osentai to Tuakoilei in 2024, 20 years later. Here's the thing, theology that defines how the world ends will also shape how the environment is treated in the present. Dispensationalism teaches what I like to call airlift theology, or as D.L. Moody described it, lifeboat theology. Those lucky enough to make it to the lifeboats let's say of the Titanic, aka the rapture. Again, that fever dream of the left behind generation where believers are expected to be supernaturally removed as the earth continues to go to hell in a handbasket. Cars with bumper stickers that say, in case of rapture, this car will be driverless. Veer off the road and cause a multi-lane pileup on the freeway. In Christian love, of course. As dispensationalists and their literal reading of passages such as 2 Peter 3:10 to 12, with the expectation that the earth will ultimately get destroyed by fire, not the refiner's fire that melts the dross, which, if you read it in context, is what it's all about, but an annihilating fire that burns absolutely everything to ash. Well, this produces what can only be described as an ecology of abandonment. If departure from a collapsing world, airlifted out of a collapsing world, is assumed to be imminent, there's little incentive to invest in any kind of long-term environmental care. The destruction of the world isn't something to prevent, in fact, it's expected. It would be like trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. As Moody would say, get in the lifeboat. Well, the result is a world to burn paradigm. Within this framework, the climate crisis isn't primarily understood as an existential threat that requires immediate action. It's simply the next stage in the prophetic doomsday sequence. Extreme weather events, famine, ecological collapse are all part of the plan. They're just indicators that the end is nigh. Nothing to see here. Move along. Okay, now are you ready for the bonus round? Okay, good. Let's add to this another layer of resistance to climate action through eschatological expectations concerning the Antichrist. Within the dispensationalist system, the end times include the rise of a single global authoritarian figure who sets up a one world government. In this logic, initiatives such as global environmental agreements are interpreted by some as potential precursors to this system of control. So documents such as the UN Agenda 21, or anything with the word agenda actually, or the Paris Agreement are, in certain circles, framed as part of a broader, insidious plot of the Antichrist. Environmental movements are not only seen as scientifically or politically misguided, they're actually part of a false anti-Christ religion in opposition to Christianity. I have heard Christians whom I know and love, who may or may not be in my own family, refer to climate action as part of the one world order religion that they call the Green Dragon. Even though this interpretation represents a minority position, it's remarkable how it's managed to shape the environmental policy stance of very influential political actors. The result is a measurable impact on the progress of global climate initiatives. Viewed as a whole, the pattern is clear. A 19th century British theological system developed in response to social uncertainty and unease embedded in widely circulated texts, and a Fijian narrative shaped through colonial publication, a newspaper competition, and education systems, both evolve into influential frameworks. These have contributed to ethno-nationalist identities, influencing international voting behavior, support settlement activity, justify political actions such as the coups. And there's not been one, there have been three. And they shape responses to global environmental challenges. The broader implications here concern the role of narrative in political life. The most influential force isn't always material power or institutional authority. It can be a localized origin story that's expanded, expounded, institutionalized, and treated as unquestionable truth. It can be a Gnostic interpretation of the end times gone viral. Again, please forgive any offense I may have caused, but I strongly believe that these are not our stories. We have much better stories, stories as old as the Christian faith, of the renewal and restoration of all creation, not of airlift, but of inheritance. When Jesus said that the meek would inherit the earth, which earth did he mean? From the first century to the 21st century, we have stories about the household of God, a people made up of every tribe and tongue who calls us to love all equally, Italke and Indian, Israeli and Palestinian, and we serve a God whose mandate to Abraham and to his seed and to us in him was to bring blessing, not destruction, not military, to every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. Vinaka Vakalevu for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that fascinating presentation about dodgy theology and dodgy stories and the devastating effects of dodgy theology. Now, we have some questions here. I'll just start off. So people do please put questions in the comments there. Um, my first question,
Before you
yeah,
ask them, if I don't know, can I say I don't know? Because history's big, the Bible's big. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. So if I don't know, I'm just
no,
going to say I don't know.
no, just make up a dodgy story.
Hey,
Uh,
come on. That might get me into hot water 150 years from now.
okay, so my first question was you said there were two questions to ask dispensationalists, and so
Mm.
the first one was where in Scripture is a 7-year tribulation? What was the second question?
The second one is they have a really weird interpretation of the 77s from Daniel 9. So the 77s, the traditional interpretation of that was that from the beginning point, it's a dated prophecy that begins with the decree for the Jewish people in exile to return to Jerusalem and to start rebuilding, right? So, the people have tried to put a date on that, whether that was Cyrus or whether it was Artaxerxes. Probably most people think it was Artaxerxes later. But from that beginning point, the prophetic clock begins, and there are 70 times 7 years, which is 490 years, right? 70 times 7. Now, what the dispensationalists do, amazingly, is they get to the final week of the 69th, the 69th of the sevens, yeah. And they say, whoa, stop the clock, because it doesn't fit the timeline anymore, right? So they have a whole week in the 77s that they have to put somewhere else, right? So where do they put it? That's where they put the 7 year tribulation. That's the 7 year tribulation, is they say, oh, that's the final week. Now, that's a little bit like saying, I want to get from Nandi to Suva. It's about 4 hours drive. Can you take me there? Sure. Well, we're going and we hit 4 hours. And and the guy who's driving me says, "Well, I thought you said 4 hours." Oh no, I forgot to tell you. There's a big gap. There's a 2,000 mile gap from the 4 hours until you get to my house, right? So we're just going to call this the beginning of that gap. What was called the church age, right? And it's a parentheses they put around the church age. So that as soon as the rapture happens, this is the system. This is how loony the system is. As soon as the rapture happens, then the 70th week. See? And they call that a literal reading of the text. It's just bizarre. Sorry,
Thank
I'm
you.
telling you the little secrets.
Thank you. Okay, so people, please do put your questions in the comments. We have a question from Glenda. Brian, can you see that? My understanding is that fundamentalist Jewish beliefs discount Jesus and that they adhere only to the Old Testament. Could you please clarify for me in light of your comments here?
Mm. Yeah, in school I used to work at in India, I had a Jewish colleague, and she liked to flippantly tell me, "Oh yeah, we believe in Jesus." He was a good Jewish boy who got into some trouble. So she wanted to put him in his place as being, yes, he was a first century Jew who came from the worldview of Second Temple Judaism, but that's all he was. Not even a prophet. He was an errant rabbi. So, and actually you can find this in the Talmud itself. When you read the Talmud, there are a number of in particular in the Babylonian Talmud, there are a number of disputed passages, but ones that really aren't disputed uh, tell of a false rabbi named Yisu, and not Yeshua, but Yeshu. And that as well is, from what I'm told, an acronym that says, "May his name be blotted out." So Yeshu, not Yeshua. Um, he not only got into a spot of trouble, but eventually he was hanged on the eve of Passover um, for his uh, for his blasphemies. So that's actually from the Babylonian Talmud there. Yes, I mean reading some of the Talmudic sources, they're not very nice to Jesus. They call him Yeshu HaNotzrim, Jesus of from Nazareth. They call Christians Notzrim as well. So Notzrim plural, actually, I should say, the Nazareans. Um, so yeah, it's a tense relationship. If you want some really good resources on just how Jewish Christianity was within the first few centuries, my favorite scholar is a guy by the name of Daniel Boyarin. And Daniel Boyarin wrote a book. The one to go to is called Borderlines, which is how Judaism and Christianity eventually parted ways. But he is an outstanding Talmudic scholar, Jewish scholar, so not a Christian, but he's fascinated with the Christian texts. And he has written a book. It's all about the Jewishness of the New Testament texts. And there was one chapter I remember called um, something like the intertextual midrash of the Johannine prologue. Oh, it's absolutely genius. So it's a tense and complicated relationship um, that seems to have involved some mutual banishments. So in at the Council of Yavne, there was a pronouncement called the Birkat Haminim, which is uh, basically putting Christians outside of the synagogues, saying you're no longer allowed in the synagogue. So there was a turning point there at the Council of Yavne. But then, of course, Christians through history returned the favor with the most virulent and fierce and brutal forms of anti-Semitism as well. That as Christians we need to take responsibility for that. So
Okay,
yeah.
thank you, Brian. Perhaps we can move on to Cole's question. He says,
Mhm.
what have you found as a good starting point in conversations, work to unpack, counter, decolonize these theologies within our faith spaces? And how can we work to deconstruct this massive and widespread misreading of Scripture?
Wow. Yeah, leave it to Cole to come up with a question like that, eh? Um, well, I would have very different approaches. So here in Fiji, I want to tread carefully with that Kaunatoni migration story. Though yes, be, I have to follow the history, I have to follow the sources. Um, but I want you to know that like I didn't make that up. This came from Fijian scholars. So these are Fijian scholars, and I could name them right now, but they won't mean anything to you. Um, I'm getting this from them. I'm not an outsider looking in saying, "Hey, this looks fishy." So I would follow the lead of, in the case of the story in Fiji, the Fijian scholarship. Let them do the heavy lifting. What I can do as a historian that's informed by decolonial historiography, there's a big mouthful, I can ask questions. And that's what I do. Like, in that story from the paper, when I get the opportunity to go to communities, I ask the questions. I don't, I try not to ask leading questions, that will get a particular answer I'm looking for. I'm just curious to know, more about this. And that was the first time that I heard that 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 story isn't theirs. I had been told that this is Fiji's story. This is Fiji's national story. Um, and I'd been in Fiji probably about 5 or 6 months at that point. So it was surprising to me to have the Matangali up in Rewa say, no, that's not our stories. We've always been here. And they did tell me some origin stories. But I'm also careful not to tell their stories. If they have shared stories with me, they've done so through relationality. So I'm not using their stories as kind of like ammunition against anything. I'm just telling you as my story. That's the story. That's the answer I got up in Natasiri Highlands. With dispensationalism, I'm I think I'm a dog with a bone. It's just ridiculous. I have very little patience for it anymore because I just see nothing but bad fruit coming out of it. It has led to, probably a lot of people deconstructing their faith. A lot of young people who watched those fever dream movies or read those books, and they get to be young adults and they're just like, man, that was harrowing. Like I had a friend of mine, this is very funny. A friend of mine was coming to pick me up one day and I was doing the dishes. And I was listening to music or something. I couldn't hear him. He was knocking on the door, and he was really knocking on the door, and I still couldn't hear him. So he went around my whole house, knocking on windows, knocking on doors. And finally, I heard him when he came to the kitchen window. And I came out, and I'm not kidding. He said, I thought you got raptured. I was just like, oh man, I'm so sorry. But this is the kind of anxiety that some people live with this airlift approach. And what I'm seeing in this airlift model of soteriology is one of complete irresponsibility. Like it makes sense that form of evangelicalism wants nothing to do with environmental action, climate action, right? Because it just doesn't fit their narrative. But what a powerful narrative it is to then say we should do nothing, right? So I have very little patience for dispensationalism. I'm like a dog with a bone with it. I have in my own story as well. I stumbled into these kinds of circles. This is why it matters to me, because as a young Christian in my early 20s, I stumbled into these sorts of churches, and it just felt so wrong. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that there's something so weird about this. And the more I read my Bible, the more I was like, yeah, that's not what this is saying, right? But then I tell you what, and this is when I got into church history. I started reading, I ordered this big 38 volume. This is how nerdy I am. Before I was a church historian, I ordered a 38 volume set of all the early church fathers up to Augustine. And I just started reading them because I wanted to know, how did the earliest Christians interpret our scriptures? That's how, I mean, yeah, I'm a nerd. That's okay. Um,
Um,
but I got
Brian, I
it
wonder
was
if we could move on to Josiah's
sure,
question here. He says,
sure.
why is Zionism so popular for Fijians? Sorry,
Mm.
Josiah, I'm squishing your question up. Why is Zionism so popular for Fijians and others, and how does Jesus meet the true needs Zionism is falsely meeting?
Yeah, good question. Again, another great question. I really am trying to figure that out myself. So when October 7th happened, I was, I was shocked, horrified. And I went out to the main gate, and the guard there, with the great name of Eperama, Abraham, so a very Jewish name, uh, he was talking to me and saying, "Oh, sir, isn't this terrible? You know what's happened?" And I said, "Yeah, it's awful." And he said, "But of course, I must support Israel." And it sounded like it was like a rugby team or something like that. Like I support Israel and those people support that team there. And I said, "Why? Why? Why do you need to support Israel as the current nation state of Israel?" He said, "Because I'm a Christian." For him, they're so absolutely wedded, these ideas that Christians must support the modern nation state of Israel. And I'm still trying to figure that out myself. And I think the Conotoni migration story is part of the answer to that, because it has given people a powerful national identity that connects them to this idea of a chosen people and a people of the land. And those people who don't belong to the land are the others that then need to be opposed, like that. There's probably much more to it. I know that, culturally speaking, things are really deep. So I'm just listening, trying to kind of figure it out as I go.
Thanks.
Um,
Brian, question from John,
yep.
from Palestinian Christians in Australia. His question is
Mhm.
whether platforming Palestinian Christian voices can help break some of the dangerous theology that underpins Christian Zionism.
Oh yeah, I believe so. I really do think so. Yeah, because most of that brand of American Christianity doesn't know just how many Palestinian Christians there are. So when we were in Israel a few years back, I met a Palestinian Christian. He called himself Jack. I can't remember what what his full name was, but he went by Jack. And though he lived within the border of on the Israeli side, he said if he wants to take his family to the beach, he has to go through 4 checkpoints with the possibility of the IDF taking his and all his family's ID away from them, and they may never see it again, because they have the right to do that. And so he says he lives with that constant fear, actually, of knowing where to go, when to go, and we went with him. He became a friend that, we would kind of travel around with, and he took us into Bethlehem. We went through the big massive walls and the checkpoints, and um, we went up to Galilee and then also followed the Jordan down. So we saw how the Golan Heights secures the one water source for the whole region, so that Israel now controls the flow of water. And when we went down, followed the river down, as soon as you hit the West Bank, it goes from before on the Israeli side of the border, plantations, kibbutzes, greenery, beautiful. And then immediately, once you get to the other side of the border, someone turned off the tap. So it's control of resources there. And all of this had to be explained to me by a Palestinian Christian. And he told me this story of he'd sometimes worked as a tour guide for American Christians coming over to the Holy Land. And some of them came from this brand of Christianity. And they would pray for the destruction of Palestinians. And he would have to tell them, "You're praying for my destruction. You're praying for my destruction." And they're, "Well, not you. No, we don't mean you, but some of they couldn't decide who they meant anymore. So yes, I think hearing Palestinian Christian voices is a very, very important complexifying of the narrative. So please, more of it. Thank you, John. Please keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Gillian's question, do Fijians see themselves as ethnically Israelites?
I think more and more don't, but those who really bought into this narrative, they did. They actually did. And there were some even very strange stories from certain regions where they overlaid their own traditional narratives with Exodus narratives. And so they would map on biblical stories over their traditional stories. It's a really powerful double storytelling at that point. But I think increasingly, so I'm just thinking about my own students here. When I've asked them about this, they said, "Yeah, you're right. That story, it appeared out of nowhere in 1892. It's not our story. It's never been our story." So more and more people are admitting that. So I don't know. It's probably, I don't know what sort of percentage we're talking about in modern day Fiji. But as I said, when I first got here, that was the story I was told, that this is our origin story. So enough people are still telling that story, right? That it's still got currency.
Thanks. Now, a question from Natalia. Are we able to receive a copy of the presentation notes, please?
Yep. Yep, for sure.
Yep. How do we do that?
Yeah. Well, I can send it to Cole. Um, now, okay, so here's the thing. I've got it written out just as a paper, which means I don't have all my sources in the text. All right. So what I do have though are my sources at the end. Okay. So it's not sourced properly as an academic paper. The paper, that separate paper that I wrote on dispensationalism and the one on the Kaunatoni migration, those are like proper academic paper with proper in-text citations. So I'm happy to share this presentation, but just keep in mind that it's just the story. But if you want to follow up on those sources, there you go. I've got all kinds of
And
great material for you.
okay, thank you. And maybe that leads into Chris's question. Who are the Fijian scholars we can follow in this area?
Yeah, the ones that really challenge the Kaunatoni migration, there are three in particular. There's a guy by the name of Peter France, and another one, Paul Garati. And then one, and those are, I believe they're Kailoma or Palang, they're Kailoma, but have been in Fiji for, their career. But there's an Itoke scholar by the name of Rokua Mataidiwa, and he wrote a really fascinating book called The Distorted Delusion, a study on the perversion of Itoke identity. So that one is really that's the one that was the bombshell for me. So yeah, there's a few there, and I can before I send this off to Cole, I'll make sure that all my sources are in there, so you can follow up with it.
Okay, do we have time for one more question? Yep, one more. Okay, so from Vainga, um, Talofa, thanks for your talk and the discussion. A New Zealand-born Samoan, just wondering what your thoughts are as to why other Pacific peoples are so supportive of Zionism and the current state of Israel.
Yeah, that's a good question. And honestly, I would have to do a similar kind of search as I've done here in Fiji with Samoa. Like the one I want to follow up on next is PNG. So I took just the simple fact that these are the countries that moved their embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as my leads. So I think the next one I would want to follow up with is PNG. Um, and PNG, I think theirs is a much more Pentecostal charismatic sort of story. At least some of the leaders in high up political positions come from that tradition. So that's a kind of that again is another interesting mix. Usually comes fully freighted with dispensationalist eschatology as well. So that's definitely part of the mix. I'm not sure about Samoa, and I would say, you're you probably know much more about Samoa than I do. You would have known some of the justifications that you've heard from people. Probably ask the elders, ask the knowledge holders, what's going on here. Ask the talatelas or the faifeaus, I think you're supposed to call them in Samoa. Ask the faifeaus. Complicated. And if there's any lesson as well from this presentation, it's one size fits all stories don't really exist. These things, when they become meta narratives, become tools of oppression. So yeah, we try to keep it multivocal. Can even use the word manyness. Pasifika's got so many different approaches. And that's up to a Samoan scholar to dig that out. I can ask my
Okay,
Samoan student.
okay, thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for this evening. So, once again, thank you so much, Brian, for your very insightful presentation and raised lots of questions and set us thinking. And hopefully, this can empower us to combat Zionism, Christian Zionism, when we encounter it. Thank you very much, Cole, for setting this up. Thank you very much, Josiah, for your technical help. And thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. See you next time.
Vinaka,
Vinaka.
sotatale.